All right, so far you've learned all of the different structures of the head and the neck and how that relates to communication. Now we're going to talk about those exact same structures in terms of swallowing. And when we think about what you learned about in the last module in the SLP scope of practice, some of you might be questioning why swallowing is part of the SLP scope of practice, and it's because all of the structures are the same, but the function of those structures is a little bit different, and we'll talk about that more in that swallowing module. So most of this is again going to be very familiar for you. We're going to talk about the lips and the teeth, the tongue, the hard palate, the velum, the pharynx, the larynx, and the different parts of the larynx. We'll talk a little bit about the trachea or the airway and its role in swallowing versus its role for providing air through the larynx for voicing. And we'll talk about now the esophagus. So the esophagus is really the only new structure that you have to learn for swallowing. Everything else is basically the same. So here we have the larynx, the pharynx, and the esophagus, the oral cavity, and the nasal cavity. So the oral cavity should be pretty evident to you in how it's involved in swallowing, in that it helps break down our food and get it ready to chew. It's really the beginning of swallowing, right? If we put something in our mouth, it's going in the oral cavity. So our relationship for the different structures in the oral cavity is what we'll talk about in just a moment for breaking that food down and getting it ready to swallow. What's going to be newer to you is the pharynx, the larynx, and the esophagus, and these are again structures that you've heard about before, but the role in these structures is now changing. So instead of being a resonating cavity to allow sound to go out of the mouth, it's actually going to help guide the food down into the esophagus. And it's going to direct that food towards the esophagus so that it doesn't go towards the airway or through the larynx to the trachea. And so the role in the larynx now is not to create voice, but to close off the airway to keep food or liquid from going into the airway. And then the top of the pharynx, what we've learned about before with the resonating cavity for the velum and the pharynx, is now not to keep sound from going through the nasal cavity, but to keep food or liquid from going through the nasal cavity, because we know that that's a very painful experience. We don't like it when food or liquid goes through the nose. It's uncomfortable because our nerves say, heck, that's not supposed to be there. It needs to get out. Similarly, for the larynx, it closes off to keep food or liquid from going through the airway, and if it gets in there, we're going to have a response to cough. And that sensation comes from the vagus nerve giving the afferent or sensory sensation to say that isn't supposed to be there, you need to get it out. And so it helps us close off the larynx to get a nice strong cough to get that liquid out of the larynx. So we're going to go through the exact same pictures again as we did for articulation, but now let's talk about how it relates to swallowing and how it changes. So these are our structures that we talked about with articulation. We have the hard palate here at the front. We don't necessarily break it down into the alveolar ridge and the hard palate with swallowing. We really just talk about it as the hard palate, but still know that these are two different structures. We have the soft palate here in the back, and in swallowing we're going to talk about the oral and the nasal side, because the nasal side is going to help keep that food from going through the nose, but the oral side is going to help keep food in our mouth, and once we swallow, it's going to keep that food from coming back into our mouth. We have the lips that are now not shaping speech sounds but keeping food in the mouth, and we have teeth that are not helping direct airflow through the teeth for articulation, but helping to chew up our food. So let's look at this again. We have the exact same anatomy as before, but again, the main role of the oral cavity now is not to shape speech sounds or to help resonating sounds bounce through, but to help break food down. So we have to have our teeth in place to help break that food down. We have to have the roof of the mouth to keep the food in the oral cavity so it doesn't go in the nasal cavity. We have to have the tongue so that it can help direct the food onto the chewing surface of the teeth and help direct that food towards our pharynx back here in the back so that it can get to the esophagus. So for our lips, again, we have the orbicularis oris that's not rounding to give us our oohs and or stretching out to give us our e's. It's now closing to keep food in our mouth. Then for our teeth, when we're thinking about our maxilla and our mandible, our jaw is now moving up and down to help break down food, and it's attached to the teeth that we've got to have there. But now we're not so much worried about how the sounds change according to the alignment of the teeth. We're thinking about how we're chewing up food. So let's think about this one right here. If our teeth are lined up with the mandible more forward than the maxilla, how can that affect chewing up steak? Or if we're missing our teeth here in the back, can you chew up steak with just your front teeth? Or if you're missing the front teeth, can you chew up food with just your back teeth, or break off a piece of cracker with just your back teeth? And how might that feel or change according to that? For the tongue, we have the different parts of the tongue. We have the tip, the body, and the root. And we're talking about the tip of the root that's going to help direct that food while we're chewing towards the teeth. We have the middle of the tongue that's also going to help a little bit with pushing that food onto the teeth. But when we swallow, we also have a movement where our food goes from the front of our tongue to the back of our tongue. And so all of these muscles are going to help direct that food back towards the pharynx. And the root of the tongue is very important for swallowing because it's going to squeeze against the back of the oropharynx so that the food goes down towards the esophagus and not towards the airway. So we want food towards the esophagus, and our air stays safe, our airway stays safe by closing off of the larynx. So there's our three structures again. So those are our very important structures. We're not going to focus so much on the esophagus now, but know that our esophagus is in the back and our larynx is in the front. We have air for the larynx, so our larynx, and our esophagus, so our food is going to the esophagus in the back. Now, believe it or not, you've learned most of the cranial nerves, and the nerves are just changing their function to give their motor movements for our swallowing, that our motor movements change a little bit differently for our speech. But what's really going to be important during swallowing is our afferent signals, so our sensory signals, because we love to taste our food, and we love to have different textures in our mouth. And so we have to have our different nerves to get those different sensations. So we have the afferent branch, or the afferent signals from the trigeminal nerve to get our sensations for the front 1/3 portion of the tongue. And it also gives us the sensation for our cheeks and our gums. As we're breaking down that food, we get that sensation also when we're breaking down the food for the food against our teeth. We have the facial nerve that's going to give us our afferent sensation for the front 2/3 of the tongue. So it's working with that trigeminal nerve to give us the entire sensation of the tongue. Then we have the glossopharyngeal nerve that gives us the sensation for the tongue, the pharynx, and the velum. And it's going to give us some of the taste sensation that we get. Then we have the vagus nerve that gives us our afferent signal for the larynx. So if anything goes into our airway and we need to cough to get it back out, we're going to get that signal from the vagus nerve. It also gives us the signal for the hypopharynx, which is kind of in this region right here, in the area of the larynx. So that if we have anything stuck in our throat that's in this area, it's going to tell us that it's there. Then we have the hypoglossal nerve that's going to give us the motor sensation for the pharynx to help squeeze that food down into the esophagus. So this is going to wrap up our anatomy portion of our module. What I want you to focus on is just those overall areas of the oral cavity and the throat, and how those areas change according to the role that they're playing. So this is just to get you thinking about all of the anatomy and physiology, getting you thinking about the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, and we'll go into more detail on these and their actual roles and what actually happens during all of these different functions in each module. Again, this isn't an anatomy class, so I'm not getting too detailed, but it's really just to help orient you to all of these different structures and their roles, and getting you prepared for future classes.